That is a baby. He may not look like much now, and he might not do much except roll around and drool. But this baby and a million other babies, they're the future of our society. This little guy could be the next Albert Einstein, or the next Hitler. Most of it depends on how he's raised. It's the age-old psychological question, nature versus nurture. And many scientists would argue that nurture plays the biggest role in your behavior and character. We've all heard the saying that a child's brain is absorbent like a sponge, that they soak up other people's behavior and spit it out themselves later. For abuse victims, this is terrible. They might have only traumatic experiences to draw from when they're trying to navigate relationships with their own partners or children. The memories can also be stored in their subconscious and haunt them for years later by emerging as mental health concerns. Childhood trauma can have long-lasting effects into adulthood, such as causing mental disorders or creating a generational cycle of abuse. Childhood is the time of life that can shape someone the most. Your character, morals, and behavior are all molded by it. Children start out as blank canvases, gradually painted by the world around them. Environment, financial situation, race and culture, and most importantly, your parents or guardians. There are many types of abuse that children suffer from. In the article written by David E. Gullett and Kathy Stockton, the most common types are physical, such as beating, sexual, and emotional abuse. According to an ongoing theory in child psychology mentioned on the Australian Institute of Family Studies site, an abused child's brain might be switching from learning mode to survival mode. Survival mode helps them stay alive and process the pain. Their mind's priority is keeping them safe from danger rather than absorbing new information and learning properly like a regular child's brain. This is not good for their school life. Many subjects build upon the basics, so doing bad in middle school math could potentially affect your trigonometry in high school. There are also many other theories right now, such as children's stress hormones being overloaded, to the point that their brain chemistry might be imbalanced due to trauma. Some of these theories require more evidence to fully prove, as research in child abuse is still fairly new. Why is research in this area so underdeveloped? Well, that's because of the nature of the issue. Abuse is not possible to experiment on real time. So subjects are usually adults retrospectively accounting their abuse from the past, which isn't exactly ideal for research. Memories can be cloudy and inaccurate, especially in cases of child abuse, which is notorious for causing amnesic disorders. Although you get better results from an actual child who is recently or currently being abused, it isn't fair to research on them because they might want to live the rest of their lives normally and not as lab guinea pigs. For scientists, there is no option to start from scratch or have a perfectly designed experiment without administering the abuse themselves or observing others do it, which is obviously not an option. It's impossible to be actually able to track victims' real-time development without being a bystander to the abuse yourself. Also, in order to fully observe the effects of childhood abuse in adulthood, the child would actually have to grow up, which makes the study extremely long-term, taking decades in just the observation stage. Trauma from childhood can damage kids' educations and careers. Possible challenges children can face in school are memory and attention issues, emotional problems, slowness in social situations, and a disruption of circadian rhythms. Most studies also suggest domestic violence and abuse to relate to lower IQs. According to the Australian Institute of Family Studies site, traumatized children might have difficulty regulating their emotions, either over or under expressing their feelings. Can you imagine how ruthless a school environment could be to a student prone to either sudden outbursts and tantrums or being extremely withdrawn and apathetic? They might be regarded as weird, either too sensitive or too robotic, maybe even bullied and severely socially disadvantaged. Trauma can cause issues with authority as well, as these children might fear or resent adults after what they've done to them at home. They expect similar frustration and maltreatment from other adults on the basis of previous experience. says Arthur H. Green in The Psychopathology of Abused Children, referring to a study with abused children who seem to be frightened and wary of adults. Not getting along with children their own age or adults such as teachers might leave them feeling alone and unable to ask for help. Their self-esteem and confidence might plummet and lead them into entirely new ways of coping, potentially involving substance abuse, self-harm, crime, unsafe sexual activities, or other dangerous forms of escapism. According to a study by Michelle V. Porsche and Lisa R. Fortuna, these effects of trauma can even lead to dropping out of high school, which they cite is, quote, not an event, but rather a process that begins as early as first grade, unquote. The study found that childhood exposure to trauma was related to higher risk for school dropout, as mediated by childhood psychiatric diagnoses. Dropping out of high school could be a dangerous route to go down if the student has no other plan in their life, and it could lead them further down roads of drug use or poverty, and that might create a cycle, which leads us into generational abuse. Abused children might run a higher risk of abusing their own children in the future, creating a generational cycle. Perhaps the longest term impact of abuse is one with no end in sight, one that can span generations if not broken out of. According to a New York Times article, studies also now indicate that about 1/3 of people who are abused in childhood will become abusers themselves. Children can internalize and normalize these actions because, well, it's the only parenting style they've ever known. It can be entirely subconscious. Some factors, according to the New York Times, that make the cycle more likely to continue are abuse that started very early or lasted a long time, the victim having a close relationship to the perpetrator, and whether the victim ever realizes that they didn't deserve the abuse. If they truly believed that their abuse was a punishment that they deserved, they can easily inflict the same pain onto another child. These factors are reportedly the most concerning for long-term impact. Green claims that, quote, there is something inherent in psychological trauma that makes it likely to be repeated, and refers to one of Freud's theories of something called repetition compulsion, seen in PTSD victims forced to constantly reenact and relive their trauma. However, there is actually a lot of debate surrounding these statistics and almost stereotypical belief of abused becoming abusers. Many experts believe that that is simplifying it. Not every abuse victim becomes an abuser, and the stereotype is actually harmful to people who are already suffering. Dante Cecchetti, a scientist specializing in the fields of developmental psychology and developmental psychopathology, says in his book about child maltreatment that being maltreated as a child puts one at risk for becoming abusive, but the path between these 2 points is far from direct or inevitable. Cecchetti says that the belief can actually hurt abuse victims, and it makes them targets of discrimination and bias, such as when a judge once denied a mother custody of her child in a court case solely because abuse victims are likely to become abusers themselves. It is important to remember that most abuse victims do not go on to abuse their own children. There are upwards of 70% of adults out there breaking the cycle and not repeating their parents' mistakes. The takeaway is that trauma doesn't always lead to abuse, but abuse does stem from trauma more often than not. One particularly extreme example of long-lasting effects of abuse is dissociative identity disorder. An important part of studying childhood trauma is looking at disorders only it is capable of causing, to see just how powerful and consuming it can be. The most intense and debated disorder, dissociative identity disorder, is based on amnesia, or the splitting off of different parts of one's mind. It can only originate from trauma under the age of 7. The mind can only fragment your identity if it has not been fully formed yet, and children's identities are not completely developed. This disorder requires extreme pain, so much that the brain is unable to handle it, and forces the child to create protectors and trauma holders within their own brain, as they likely do not have any externally. This is one of the brain's most powerful coping mechanisms, designed to keep the child safe from the levels of torture they are suffering so that they can move on rather than sink into their memories. Research on DID is also relatively new, as many psychologists question the extent and frequency as to which this disorder affects people. Despite the controversies and lack of perfect research, no one can deny that these disorders exist, and that child abuse plays a huge part in it. Over 1 billion children face violence and abuse every year. And it is a sad reality that the pain for some might not be going anywhere, that it is being stored in their subconscious to relive or repeat. Although most victims don't hurt others, the fact that they have had to suffer so much so young speaks volumes about the progress still to be made. If research continues looking into how trauma can affect brains, then laws and policies might change in favor of the children someday, so that no child would ever have their life destroyed by abuse again.